Is Kayla Sheehan. I am the marketing manager at Sea Education Association, and joining me is my colleague, Dr. Elizabeth Mendenhall, Associate Professor of Marine Affairs at the University of Rhode Island. Dr. Mendenhall's research focuses on the drivers and mechanism of change in global ocean governance, specifically with regards to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea and associated institutions. Dr. Mendenhall serves as a professor for SEA's Ocean Policy Marine Protected Areas Summer Program. And tonight she's going to share more about one of the most challenging ocean governance topics today, deep sea mining, whether we should do it, and who decides. So, Dr. Mendenhall, take it away.
Thank you so much, Kayla. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Um, can you see the big version now, right?
Yes.
Okay. And then it's the opening slide.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, I just want to make sure I have this chat up too. I'm sure all these students have had online classes before and they know how it goes. Um, okay. I actually can't see the chat. Kayla, if you notice anything, perhaps you could interrupt me and direct my attention to it. Okay, great.
Absolutely.
Because I'm only going to go for 20 to 30 minutes. That's the plan. And as Kayla mentioned, I do teach for SEA in the upcoming summer program, Ocean Policy, Marine Protected Areas. And while this talk has some relevance to those topics, which I'll point out at the end, this is sort of a separate topic that I just wanted you prospective students to know about, to maybe get you interested in the part of the Pacific that our voyage will be sailing through. So I'm going to cover the basics, the places, the people, the controversy, and give you a sense of how seabed mining is governed and managed and what the controversies are related to it. And I hope by the end of this presentation, you'll understand why this is such a critical issue at this time, and that we're actually living through a very historical moment when it comes to the international community making decisions about whether or not we mine the seafloor. So the place that we're talking about is called the area, which is obviously like the least creative name we could have come up with, but that is the formal treaty name for the seabed beyond national jurisdiction. So we're talking about places in the middle of the ocean at the sea floor, not the water column or the sea surface, just the sea floor. And if you come to SEA this summer and you take my course, you're going to learn all about the different zones in the ocean created by this Convention on the Law of the Sea, which we call UNCLOS. It's this big treaty negotiated in the 70s and 80s, and it's what I'm an expert in. And it basically tells every country in the world who can do what in which part of the ocean. And it divides the ocean up into all these different zones. The zone that we're interested in is the area, which, as you can see on this image, it's out in the middle of the ocean, so it's beyond national jurisdiction zones. But it's different than the high seas. The high seas is its own legal zone where we do stuff like fishing or ships doing trade, navigate across the surface of the ocean. The thing about the high seas is it's governed by this sort of like handful of fragmented intergovernmental or international organizations that each sort of does their own thing. And when you're talking about the high seas as a whole, you got to know about a lot of different organizations. The area is different in that it's governed by one intergovernmental organization. It's called the International Seabed Authority. So hereafter, I might say ISA, I mean the International Seabed Authority. The ISA is autonomous. It's not under the hierarchy of the United Nations. It's not controlled by any one country. It's an intergovernmental organization that makes decisions on its own. It's located in Kingston, Jamaica, which was a very explicit decision made by the international community when they were figuring out the details of the ISA, because historically we put all these ocean governance institutions in places like London or Geneva or Brussels. And the idea was to kind of share the attention and share the wealth that comes with headquartering an intergovernmental organization. So they chose Jamaica. So Jamaica is where all the countries that are members of the International Seabed Authority, because it's intergovernmental. So one country is one member, gets one vote. They come together and they make decisions about what happens in the international seabed. So their mandate, their jurisdiction, their job is to control, organize, and manage any activities in the area or the international seabed. But the main activity that's happening there, or that will happen there, is seabed mining. So the ISA makes the rules for seabed mining. Those rules are colloquially, like in everyday talk, we refer to them as the mining code. So the ISA makes the mining code, which are the rules for seabed mining. But before we talk about the 21st century and what's going on with seabed mining today, we got to keep our heads in the 1970s and 1980s because the International Seabed Authority is a product of that time. It was created or it was established by UNCLOS, that Convention on the Law of the Sea, the Constitution for the Oceans, that one big treaty that tells us who can do what in different parts of the ocean. And UNCLOS was completed in 1982. So the ISA, its kind of design and function, it matters a lot now, but it ties back to movements that were going on in the 70s and 80s that kind of determined how we were going to manage the area, how decisions were going to be made, and what our goals were. So the ISA, sometimes when you read about it, like in the New York Times or like popular media, they'll say this kind of obscure, esoteric, intergovernmental organization. They act like it's not that big of a deal, but the ISA is a huge deal. I would say it is one of the most future-oriented, most radical, progressive intergovernmental organizations that we have. And the reason is that it was an outgrowth of these social and political movements in the 1970s, where the newly independent former colonies, which now we might refer to as the developing countries or the global South, they got together in a coalition to advocate for rewriting international law, like in general, but especially in the ocean, for redoing international law to be more fair and more equitable to these former colonial territories that are now independent countries that are kind of trying to develop and make it on their own. And the countries, they got together in this coalition and they were pushing for economic justice, for a more fair way to access and share resources. And they got a lot of what they wanted in the Law of the Sea Convention, and especially in the International Seabed Authority. And the main thing that they advocated for was this principle of the common heritage. At the time, they said common heritage of mankind, but in the latest Ocean Governance Treaty, we've changed it to common heritage of humankind because we don't need the gendered language, and it essentially means the same thing. So I might say common heritage or CHM, but I mean the same kind of principle. The radical idea of the common heritage principle is that the area and its resources, that international seabed that has a bunch of minerals, they belong to all of humanity, including me, Kayla, everybody watching the webinar, everyone else who you're going to sail with on the Siemens, hopefully. The international seabed and its resources belong to all of us. And the key idea behind that is if and when we use those resources, we do seabed mining, we have to do equitable benefit sharing. That it's really supposed to happen that when there's millions, potentially billions of dollars of profit from seabed mining, the International Seabed Authority is supposed to take some of those profits and distribute them equitably between countries in the world. So it's a very radical, very different idea. There's no place on earth that is the common heritage other than the international seabed. And in the late 70s, they tried to declare the moon the common heritage of humankind also, but that treaty didn't work out. Not enough countries agreed to ratify it. So the only common heritage we've got where we're supposed to equitably share the benefits of those resources is the international seabed. Now, it does sound really radical and progressive in that it's an idea of like international sharing and sharing with equity so that developing states or states that need more receive more. And that was sort of really pushed in the 70s and 80s. But in the early 1980s, when Ronald Reagan was elected, the United States basically changed its tune on the Law of the Sea Convention and said, this is too radical. Common heritage sounds too much like communism. This is international taxation. This is economic planning, we don't like this. And so the Reagan administration refused to ratify the Law of the Sea Convention and got a bunch of its other industrial allies to also not ratify because common heritage was too radical and they didn't like what the International Seabed Authority was going to be. So the states are, sorry, when I say states, I mean the same as countries. I'm a political scientist and we use the term state as kind of a technical term to mean country. But anyway, when the developing countries who had really pushed for the International Seabed Authority and the Common Heritage, and they had all ratified UNCLOS and they really wanted it to be a successful treaty, they got together in the 90s and decided to change the treaty a little bit. It's called an implementing agreement to basically make the Seabed Authority more in line with, quote, sound commercial principles. So basically, the Seabed Authority would involve less transfer of technology, less sharing of money. That would still happen. It's still common heritage. We still have to share some benefits, but it's reduced. And also less likely to impede commercial mining for profit. So the ISA, the Seabed Authority, and what common heritage looks like, it was modified or sort of scaled back in the 1990s. And then all those other developed industrialized states, other than the United States, which still hasn't ratified UNCLOS, but the others started to get on board. And so the Law of the Sea Convention, UNCLOS, it got enough countries to ratify in the 1990s that it entered into force. And all of a sudden, it's an active treaty, and the ISA is established in 1996. So it's been around for, 3 decades now, almost 3 decades, but it's still working on making those rules for international seabed mining. And at this point, companies and countries are really pushing like, hey, we want to finally do this large scale seabed mining, but the ISA isn't quite done writing the rules. Now I'm gonna get just a little bit more in the weeds before we go back out to the big picture. So you recall that in the mid 1990s, we modified the International Seabed Authority to be a little bit more capitalistic and a little bit less like communism, a little bit less top-down planned. Well, one special rule that they added in this 1994 agreement is called the 2-year rule. And the 2-year rule is this. If you are a mining entity, maybe you're a country, maybe you're a company that's sponsored by a country. For example, the small island state Nauru is a country that sponsors the metals company, which will actually do the mining. If you're done exploring, you found minerals in the area that you want to explore, that the ISA gave you permission to explore in, and you're ready to move to the next phase of exploitation, so commercial scale mining, where you're actually going to sell a bunch of minerals and make a bunch of profits. If you're ready, but the ISA isn't done writing the mining code, then you can start a 2-year clock that gives them 2 years to finish the rules. And if they don't finish the rules, that treaty says the Seabed Authority must provisionally approve commercial scale seabed mining. Well, Nauru and the metals company triggered this 2-year rule 3.5 years ago. And when the deadline ran out, the ISA, they weren't done, and they said, we need more time. We need 2 more years. So that would be until this upcoming summer, because this all happened in June. At this point, the ISA is still not done writing the rules. The metals company says they're going to submit a plan of work to do commercial scale exploitation this summer with or without the rules being done. And so that's why this moment is a really interesting moment in the politics of seabed mining. And you might be asking, like, why doesn't the ISA just finish the rules? Like they've had since 1996, they've been working on this. Well, these rules, they have to protect the marine environment while also enabling seabed mining. And they have to come up with a formula for taking some profits from seabed mining and equitably redistributing them to the international community. It's a very difficult political and also technical challenge. So the ISA is meeting probably right now, it's probably too late in the day, but like in general, every day, Monday through Friday, to try to get the rules written. So we're at this key moment. So that's a point in time but I'm going to take you to a point in space. This is the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. Students in the know will call it the CCZ. Start by looking at this map at the top left and see where the Clarion-Clipperton Zone is located. It's kind of between Mexico and Hawaii. It's a very expansive region. And the SEA voyages are often in and out or around these regions. So the Clarion-Clipperton Zone is where seabed mining is likely to happen first. There's a bunch of what's called these polymetallic nodules. They're like these little mineral potatoes, and they're just strewn across the flat, squishy, abyssal plain. And I'm not a scientist, I'm a political scientist, but my understanding is that over millions of years, dissolved minerals in the water, they precipitate, they slowly form together to make these nodules. The Clarion-Clipperton Zone is full of these nodules. And this is, of course, a part of the area of the international seabed. So this map shows blocks where countries working with companies typically have sort of didsed an area. And what they do is they start by getting a contract for exploration. It's a 15-year contract, and they get it in a certain spot, as shown by these different colored blocks. And then when that 15 years expires, they can apply, as Nauru and the Metals Company are doing, apply for an exploitation permit. So this is from the ISA website. There's a lot of documentation there. If you're interested in this topic, I definitely encourage you to go on the website and see what's available. This is a table of all the groups that have applied to at least start the exploration for seabed mining. And if you just go down this list, you'll notice that sometimes it's the government of India, sometimes it's just a country. But more often you see something like the Cook Islands Investment Corporation, which is kind of a consortium where the country is involved, but most of the financing comes from private companies. The United States, by the way, cannot formally participate in this system because since the US hasn't ratified the Law of the Sea Convention, we cannot be members of the International Seabed Authority and cannot sponsor or do seabed mining on our own in the area. And China is the one that has the most of these permits, which is worrying some in the United States because the minerals down there are copper, nickel, iron, gold, cobalt, rare earth elements, things that are really important for the batteries that power our smartphones and our advanced technology. And you can see on the bottom left and also the top right of my images here what the polymetallic nodules look like, those mineral potatoes. I got 3 more slides. So this is sort of the state of seabed mining in the sense that there are 31 contracts for exploration. They're starting to expire. And these mining contractors, they're starting to say, hey, we're ready for exploitation. We're ready to do this mining in a big way. And the ISA is kind of sort of stuck because the rules we negotiated in the 70s, 80s, and 90s say, hey, the role of the ISA is to organize seabed mining. And it's got to do so in line with sound commercial principles. If the market wants these minerals and the exploration permit has expired, remember the ISA has to provisionally approve mining happening even this summer. But a lot of people and a lot of countries and a lot of environmental groups aren't happy with that. And there's a growing call for a moratorium. This term moratorium, it really means temporary pause. But we've had a moratorium on commercial whaling, like hunting of whales, since 1986, and it just keeps extending and extending and extending. So at this point, these 32 countries are arguing for some form of either stopping seabed mining completely or having a 10-year pause or a 25-year pause. So there's this growing movement where countries are saying, actually, we shouldn't do this seabed mining. And that's really why this is such an interesting political topic right now, because there's really good arguments on both sides. Those who are in favor of mining will point to the fact that this is already baked into the ocean governance system. Back in the 70s and 80s, that group of 77 developing states, they made a lot of deals with the developed countries. They gave things up to get the Common Heritage Principle, to get the International Seabed Authority. So the benefits could be gotten from the deep ocean and then shared equitably. So we have to do this. We agreed to do this decades ago. And the benefits won't just go to seabed mining companies, it's not just big companies making profits, but some of those benefits will go to the world's poorest who could really use kind of an influx of money that comes from this system. My second group here on the left is a newer set of arguments that some argue is trying to greenwash seabed mining. But it is true that the minerals that are down there are very important for creating batteries. And for a quick renewable energy transition, switching from fossil fuels to solar and wind, for example, we need lots of cheap batteries because the sun doesn't shine all the time and the wind doesn't blow all the time. So batteries are critical for renewable energy systems being able to consistently power homes, global economy, etc. And then also you hear this little argument, well, if we don't mine the deep sea, there's all this demand for minerals for advanced technology. We're going to do land-based mining, which is worse environmentally and definitely worse for human rights. So you see kind of like a green argument in favor of seabed mining also. And specific to the United States, you see a lot of concern that, hey, China is getting access to all these critical strategic minerals. The US should get involved and should mine through the Seabed Authority as well. The arguments against are primarily environmental. So if you look at this graphic on the right, you can see that the way seabed mining would work would be essentially sending like a tractor down to remotely operate or be remotely operated on the sea floor that would sort of gobble up these minerals, suck them up a tube, but along with a bunch of that squishy sediment that the minerals sit on, and that would cause a sediment plume because at some point that really fine sediment has to be re-released back into the ocean. So mining would directly destroy habitats, they argue. The sediments would definitely suffocate filter feeders. If you think about it, like if you're a sponge that's filtering the water to eat and you're coated in all this fine sediment, you're not going to be able to get what you need from the water around you. And of course, mining is very noisy, and noise pollution affects a lot of different species, not just marine mammals. There's also the general argument that we know so little about seafloor ecosystems that we don't know what we're going to be losing. We don't really understand the cost-benefit trade-off here. And so you see scientific studies coming out about that are sort of speculative in terms of the broader role that deep sea ecosystems play in the carbon cycle and carbon sequestration. And also the idea that the creatures down there are so interesting and different that their genetic code can be very valuable to, for example, develop new pharmaceutical products. So if we destroy these places for mining, we won't be able to use them for these other things. So it's a very active debate, and you have regions split. So even the Pacific region, where the Siemens operates for SEA, goes often between places where, Tonga is pro seabed mining and the Cook Islands is pro seabed mining, but Fiji is very against seabed mining. So there isn't the usual lineup where it's like the global north versus the global south, or island states versus landlocked countries. It's sort of crosses a lot of different other group divides, the seabed mining debate. So this summer, I'm not going to be teaching about seabed mining directly. I'll be teaching about marine protected areas, especially in the Pacific region. But as you can see, these MPAs, especially these very large ones, there's a new trend of declaring large MPAs. They're declared in a lot of places where the minerals are. And so as you'll learn, hopefully through taking my class or maybe through reading or other classes at your home universities, marine protected areas, they're very rarely no economic activity in this area. Usually they kind of pick and choose about what's allowed and what's not allowed. And as you'll see, many of these MPAs still allow fishing or still allow seabed mining even. And also within this ISA system, these boxes here, the APEI, those are areas of particular environmental interest. The ISA has its own kind of marine protected area system specific to seabed mining. So in learning about marine protected areas, both within jurisdictions and beyond jurisdictions, seabed mining and seabed minerals will definitely be very relevant. Oh, I put some like a broader description of topics below. I am an international relations PhD. I'm a political scientist, and I focus on how countries do or do not cooperate to manage the ocean well. So in a class like this, we got to learn more about ocean governance. We got to learn more about the Pacific region. And we address marine protected areas in terms of, from conceptualization to implementation. What are the choices made along the way, and how do they balance different social, political, economic interests, but also the legal system that we already have? So if you're interested in my work and what I might bring to this class, please go to my website and look at the research page because I'm very into seabed mining, but I do a lot relevant to ocean governance more broadly as well. Thanks. Back to you, Kayla.
Thank you. That was incredibly interesting to learn. Um, I apologize to everybody. I did not pot. You were on a roll. And so
Oh,
I was
sorry.
not interrupting for some questions. So I'm going to answer some of the questions that came through the Q&A. However, just want to remind everybody you can submit questions through not only the Q&A, but also through the chat.
I see the Q&A now. I did
Yeah.
pull that up. Yeah.
So we're going to start with who are the people in the rooms of the ISA discussions? Are they scientists, politicians? Who makes up that group?
Great question. So mostly it is diplomats or representatives of countries. So it's not always a career diplomat. They could send some of their scientists. But that room I showed you of the International Seabed Authority, where there's like chairs that are in a semicircle, like the UN system or any other large intergovernmental organization, the seats are designated in alphabetical order by member country. And so the front rows are always representatives of countries. The back rows are observers. So the United States is an observer because we're not a full member, but you also see um, industry organizations and sometimes environmental organizations filling in as observers. And so they can be present, but they are always disadvantaged when it comes to the opportunity to speak because it's an intergovernmental organization, and countries are really jealous of kind of their privileged role in decision making. The last thing I'll say is that the International Seabed Authority is really criticized for its low transparency. So the mining code is often like the technical details are addressed in a separate subcommittee where observers aren't directly allowed. So it can be very hard to study the ISA. And that's why the website is so valuable because they do put a lot of documentation up that's available to researchers.
Thank you. The next one is, are any countries currently doing deep sea mining within their own
Yeah,
zones?
within their own zones, which the relevant zone here would be the continental shelf. Some countries are doing seabed mining of different types. So, for example, there's been kind of an active offshore diamond mine off the coast of Namibia for some time. One project that you may have heard about if you've delved into this topic before is in Papua New Guinea. They've authorized some seabed mining on their continental shelf that ended up caused a lot of domestic controversy and ended up not going forward. Also, the Cook Islands is authorizing seabed mining on its continental shelf. But kind of an important generalization to make is that most seabed mining in the deep sea, so not right off the coast,
Mhm.
is still in an earlier exploratory phase. And all the seabed mining in the area, so beyond national jurisdiction, so far is only in that exploratory phase. So the main difference is scale. They're not taking minerals out at scale. They're still figuring out like how the minerals are distributed.
Awesome. I am an educator who had my high school read Susan Casey's The Underworld, where we learned about deep sea mining. Any suggestions for study and experiences for those who aren't yet in college?
Ooh, that last part, those who aren't yet in college, trips me up a little bit because there is John Oliver's last week tonight, he did a story on deep seabed mining, which I like to assign to my students, but it's John Oliver, he's a comedian. So the journalism is very good, but it's helpful to assign that to adults. I don't have parents being upset with me, but there's also a 60-minute story on deep seabed mining. The reason I'm like reaching towards videos is I think it's really cool to see the footage from remotely operated vehicles, and you can see what these habitats are really like. One thing I really didn't emphasize for time in this talk is there are the nodules, and Carolyn, those are manganese nodules on the opening slide. I call them polymetallic nodules because while they're dominated by manganese, we want to mine the other things mostly. Um, but also minerals are at hydrothermal vents is one location where we're focusing on because hydrothermal vents you've probably heard of. They're these like mineral rich hot vents where water shoots out and there's these creatures that do chemosynthesis. So instead of photosynthesis being the base of the food chain, it's chemosynthesis. And so it's like a totally different kind of genetic makeup for creatures. They're really interesting genetically ecosystems, but like the creatures cluster around the hydrothermal vent. That's also where the mineral crusts form. So that's a really clear example of direct habitat destruction that could occur with mining. And there's all kinds of footage, still on the topic of recommendations from like the EV Nautilus. I follow them on social media. They'll sometimes even do live things, but they're like videos of their deep sea exploration. And sometimes you can see, that Dumbo octopus is over a field of nodules. So any kind of education about unique deep sea ecosystems that are on the sea floor are going to be good content for thinking about the problem of seabed mining.
Do you expect any changes to the U.S. position on deep sea mining with the new administration?
That's a hard question because I think that there's a fair amount of unpredictability in what the new administration might do any given day. I don't expect it, um, because I think it's unlikely that a Republican administration in general, but Trump's specifically, would favor the U.S. ratifying a new treaty and joining a new intergovernmental organization. The opposition to the Seabed Authority and to UNCLOS in the United States is a subset of the Republican Party, which is all you need because in the Senate you need two-thirds support to ratify. So it's not all Republicans, but those who oppose the Law of the Sea Convention are within the Republican Party. The alternative proposal that some Republicans make is that the United States should create its own multilateral treaty to govern seabed mining in the area. That we don't want a free for all, but we don't like the ISA, so let's do our own system. But that's what we did in the 80s when we were opposing, the Reagan administration was opposing UNCLOS and the Seabed Authority because we didn't like common heritage. We created new domestic legislation and new intergovernmental cooperation to try to set up an alternative system. But when in the 90s it was modified, all the other developed industrialized countries were like, okay, we don't like that idea. We're going to the UNCLOS one. And so the United States really couldn't do that again because it would be on its own. Um, so I think that if US companies want to do seabed mining, the workaround is they headquarter in another country, get another sponsor. And so there isn't really like a strong urgency, I think, for the US to do this. So it kind of depends on where their attention turns, but I don't expect any change.
Great. And what is to stop deep sea mining from following in the same path as mining on land? As in, these companies will mine to the end of their resources, then be left with nothing once again. I'll start with that question.
Yeah.
There's a few part here.
I mean, the answer is simple. The only thing that can and will stop that is the International Seabed Authority. Both the rules that it makes, the specificities of that, but also more generally, its credibility and authority. And that's a main reason why the area was declared the common heritage and the ISA was created, because countries, especially developing countries, were afraid that the more industrialized coastal countries like the US would claim out more and more and more, and they'd kind of gobble up the seafloor for their national territory. So this was a way to say, let's stop, let's make decisions cooperatively as an international community. Let's keep in mind cultural heritage, environmental protection, promoting scientific research. Those are all kind of sub goals of the Seabed Authority, but still enable seabed mining in a way that's controlled. But Amira, like any sectoral organization like that manages a particular industry or a particular sector, there's always the concern about regulatory capture. Like it's the idea of the fox guarding the hen house. So the most recent, he's just now the former executive director, the secretary general of the ISA, was accused of corruption, that he was sort of in the pocket of seabed mining companies, and he was going to make the rules really easy to enable too much seabed mining. So it's still a risk or a concern.
And then the other part to the question is, are hydrothermal vents being considered as a special location to protect when writing these deep sea mining rules?
That is a yes, a no, and an I don't know. The yes is that environmental non-governmental organizations like Greenpeace or Pew or the World Wildlife Fund, they are doing the work to kind of prepare lists and promote certain areas that should be protected. And they're definitely thinking about particular hydrothermal vent ecosystems that need protection and drawing attention to that. The no is that the ISA um, isn't really prioritizing areas of protection right now. And the way the system has worked is as they issue new permits, they also kind of protect nearby areas that will be sort of, they're supposed to serve for like baseline data. And so it's not their priority or their agenda to start protecting places. Their priority is to enable, organize, control seabed mining. The I don't know part of the answer is the Legal and Technical Commission, which is the kind of subgroup that's working on the mining code, they're behind closed doors. And so the details of what they're emphasizing in the mining code are not yet available to me. There is a draft of the mining code up there, um, but it's hard for a researcher here in Rhode Island to say for sure this is what they are or are not talking about behind closed doors.
Um, and then I guess one question that came to me after Molly asked about students is just for students that are interested in following the progress of the policies and the governance,
Mhm.
what are the best resources to continue to keep up to date with any changes or things like that?
Yeah, okay, so three recommendations. The first is Google Alerts. I have a weekly Google alert that compresses or like compiles my Google alerts. I have one for International Seabed Authority, marine protected areas, overfishing, and I think the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Treaty. And the International Seabed Authority one is pretty fruitful because there is a lot of journalism happening around it right now. So that's the best way to ensure that you're kind of consistently keeping up to date, looking at the news and recent developments. Second suggestion is a journalism organization called Manga Bay. It is really well respected in the ocean governance community, and it does short updates, but also more long form journalism about international ocean governance topics. My third recommendation is Blue Sky. I have switched from X to Blue Sky, and so have a lot of other social scientists, scholars, researchers, diplomats. You're seeing organizations shift to Blue Sky. And so if you create a Blue Sky account and you really curate who you're following, and you can do that with these lists, there's like lists of seabed mining scholars, law of the sea scholars. That's a great way to get updates and kind of an analysis as things change.
Great. There was another question. I know you said that most of the individuals within the ISA are representatives and diplomats. Are there any rules that the ISA has to work with marine scientists in creating their rules, or is that up to them?
Yeah, the generally wouldn't see a rule that specific in an international treaty. The treaty that established the ISA does say that one of its mandates is environmental protection, but it's like a secondary mandate to controlling, organizing, and managing activities. Um, a lot of times, marine scientists come in as part of national delegations um, or work with national delegations. And so I think it's generally recognized that marine science and the marine scientific community has a lot of important stuff to say at the ISA, but that's more something that's happening in practice than required by the rules, I would say. And of course, I'm sure you're aware that in an area or on a topic where there's a lot of scientific uncertainty, if a country really wants to find science that supports their claims or impugns the claims that they don't like, there's a lot of politics to how you mobilize and marshal scientists and which ones you invite and don't invite. So it's really hard to see or create a situation where it's scientists advising diplomats and diplomats listening. That's kind of rare in ocean governance, and definitely something that I talk about in this class quite a bit when it comes to marine protected areas. Because the ideal is that the scientists tell you where to protect, what to protect from, and then the policymakers make that rule and then it's well implemented. But politics seeps in all along the way. And so it's never that simple of a story.
And I think that was our last question. I'm going to just, as we do this, I'm going to drop the link to your research page on your website. And then for anybody who has questions about, as Beth mentioned, she will be leading our Ocean Policy Marine Protected program this summer. And if you have questions about that program or any of our upcoming programs in general, I'm dropping another link that goes to our scheduling of an advising call, which allows you to just have that one-on-one conversation. There's a lot of different institutions that have different processes around how to apply for that and stuff. So it allows us to answer all your questions individually. But thank you so much, Dr. Mendenhall, for being here with us and sharing more about deep sea mining.
Sure, can I just say one last thing to the prospective
Absolutely.
students? I did this SEA experience for the first time last summer, and I am coming back because learning and living and working on the boat was really cool. And it was a very new experience for me. I'm from Kansas originally. I don't have a sailing background, but it was so enriching that I really hope that you all can have the opportunity and the interest to join me this summer because it's a really amazing experience and you'll learn a lot that's on the syllabus. That's the law of the sea content, but you'll learn so much more that you didn't expect.
Great.
And we saw so many whales.
We did see some whales.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everybody. I hope you guys have a wonderful evening.